Hi folks, Brian Hallaq back again for another conversation about guns. The last go around was with my pro-gun friends, so this go around let's talk about things for my anti-gun friends. So one of the things that comes up, and I think that creates the disconnect between the two sides when we talk is I think a fundamental lack of understanding about the Bill of Rights. I think some of my anti-gun friends believe that gun rights are just another law. Yeah, there's this thing called the Second Amendment, but it's really some sort of outdated concept, and it really is just some sort of regular laws that could be repealed without too much fanfare. And they're not really looking at it or thinking about it in the same way that we think about other laws, or excuse me, I should say other laws, other constitutional rights. And so we have to get back to basics on this a little bit. And I think right now is a great time to be talking about this. As of the date of this video, the filming of this video, just sort of current events, a little while ago there was a film made here in the United States that depicts the Muslim prophet Muhammad in a very, very negative way. And as a result of the video's release, what ends up taking place is the video is either shown or talked about in the Islamic world, and violence has erupted. I think by and large, the filmmakers, that was their ultimate intent. Their ultimate intent was to incite Muslims to violence, and by doing so, sort of prove their point. And unfortunately, again, as of the date of this video, dozens of people have died in the violence that's ensued, and actually several heroic Americans died, perhaps either from the video or tangentially related to the release of the video, either as a pretext for a different type of terrorist attack that took place on our embassy in Libya. All of which are very tragic. There's just no doubt about it. That type of violence is not in keeping with American values. But what's interesting is our response as a country, and I think we responded appropriately. I think as a country, both sides of the political spectrum recognized that while the video itself may be offensive, the people that made it had a right to make it, because we respect the freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and that there may have been unintended, well, at least on the part of the rest of us, consequences with the release of that video. It's really just a sad consequence of our ability to have freedom in this country. So for us, the freedom of speech is so important that if it ends up inciting violence in a foreign land, that's just an unfortunate consequence of our liberties here in the United States, and we treasure those liberties so much that we are okay with there being some collateral damage associated with it. And I hate that word, collateral damage. Please understand, I'm not making light of the fact that people died, but unfortunately that's kind of the term of art that's used. And so what's important to recognize is that liberty isn't necessarily a clean or antiseptic concept. It's actually down and dirty. There's really nothing that's very, very clean about liberties. Anytime we give liberties away to an individual, we take power away from the group. And when we do that, there's going to be some fallout, and there's going to be some damage, and sometimes there's deaths, and sometimes there are injuries. And that holds true with all of the liberties that are enshrined in our Constitution. If we think about our rights against unlawful search and seizure, at the end of the day, what are those rights really protecting? They're protecting privacy rights. They're protecting an overreaching law enforcement. But ultimately, they're really protecting the guilty person. If the police overreach and search someone's vehicle illegally, what happens is the punishment is that evidence is not allowed to be used against the criminal defendant at trial. Well, think about that. What we're really saying is we're willing as a society to let a guilty person go free rather than accept what the truth of the matter was, which was that he or she was committing the crime. And again, it's an ugly result. I mean, people can get killed, people can get injured from those types of compromises. But again, as a society, we've decided that for the sake of liberty, we're willing to accept some injury, some loss, in exchange for conferring this liberty upon the individual, and that being unlawful search and seizure, prohibition on unlawful search and seizure. Think about the prohibition against self-incrimination, your so-called Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. What are we really saying there? We're saying that somebody who might inadvertently have to or be compelled to testify against themselves and potentially confess a crime is constitutionally protected from having to do so. Well, wait a minute. What are we really saying? We're saying that a guilty person is not going to have to confess to a crime in a court of law because we have this Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. At its outset, though, it's a very important right. There's simply no question that unlawful search and seizure, the right against self-incrimination, these are important tenets of our democracy. And yeah, they're going to result in some guilty people potentially going free. And are we talking about potentially violent people? Sure. There is the potential for injury or even death as a result? Possibly. And that's just a function of granting these kinds of rights and liberties to people. And my anti-gun friends are really the first civil libertarians to come forth and espouse those virtues. And we're seeing it right now in the case of the video that was released and the violence that's been sparked as a result. My civil libertarian friends are the first ones to say, you know what, as ugly as that video was and the violence that resulted, we respect that person's right to do it. We don't necessarily respect the person or the content of the film, but the right to do it must be protected above all costs, and sometimes those costs are going to result in death. It's how rights work. We have to protect the parts of liberty that we don't appreciate. We don't appreciate the Klansmen that march in protest down the center of Main Street. But the fact of the matter is, in order to allow peaceful, nonviolent protest of other nature, we have to protect the rights of people who are protesting for things that we don't agree with. So all of these sort of ugly consequences ensue whenever we confer rights on people. And the Bill of Rights is sort of the ultimate expression of that. Now here's where the disconnect happens. My friends in the anti-gun community recognize all of that right up until it comes to the Second Amendment. And somehow when it comes to the Second Amendment, the idea that there are negative consequences associated with those liberties, they're just unacceptable to them. And this is where, again, we as gun rights advocates and you as folks that believe in stricter gun control are unable to have a conversation on a level playing field. Because for us, we look at the Second Amendment the way you might look at the First Amendment. And they really are on equal par. There isn't one amendment that has more validity than another amendment. But for the anti-gunners, unfortunately, what you do is you poo-poo the Second Amendment and make it sound like it's either some kind of an amendment that has seen its day, come and gone, or it's really not as valid as other amendments to the Constitution, other parts of the Bill of Rights. It's just not as good for you as other parts of the Bill of Rights. You don't get to pick and choose which rights you think are better than others. You just don't. You have to recognize that each of the Bill of Rights in and of itself is a sacred right. It's conferred by the Constitution, and unless we as a society elect to change it, it is in fact a right as valid as any other rights enshrined in the Constitution. Now, for a while there was this large debate about whether or not the Second Amendment really regulated militias versus personal firearms ownership, and with the Supreme Court case of Heller and others that have interpreted Heller, what we have now is a body of law that says it is an individual right. It's not a collective right to protect the area by use of a militia. It is an individual right. So that's pretty well been settled. So for my anti-gun friends, you have to recognize that you can't pick and choose different rights of the Constitution, different parts of the Bill of Rights, and say, well, this one is more valuable than another. When you do that, what happens is we as anti-gunners, we as pro-gunners, tune you out. We stop listening to your message. Now, if you want to come forth with the argument of, well, maybe the Second Amendment is an outdated right. Okay, that's a different kind of an argument. You're not denigrating my right or saying it's worth less than, say, the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment or the Fifth Amendment. What you're saying is that somehow because the sign of the times has come and gone, perhaps it's an amendment that ought to be reviewed or revisited as being stale or no longer relevant. Now we can have an honest conversation. I can put forth my reasons and my arguments for believing that it is relevant here today in modern society, and you can put forth your arguments to say that it's not. When we have this conversation, what we need to do is recognize that we are a nation of liberties. We've chosen to be a nation of liberties, and because of that, we can't pick and choose our favorite liberties as being, well, those are ours, you can't touch those, and then others, those are up for grabs. We have to recognize that liberties are liberties are liberties, and because of that, there is going to be some fallout from that. I would love to tell you that there was a way for us to make sure that firearms would never result in an accident. It's not possible. There are going to be accidents with respect to firearms. What we're saying is, as a society, we're willing to accept those accidents because of the benefits conferred by those liberties. The same way we were willing to accept the fact that some guy could put up a YouTube video and result in or cause violence overseas that would result in the death of dozens of people and many Americans. So what I'm hoping here in today's conversation is to get you guys looking at the debate in a slightly different way. When you talk to us about the Second Amendment, don't talk to us about the Second Amendment as if it's not as important as the First Amendment. For us, the First, the Second, the Fourth, the Fifth, all of the amendments mean something to us on a very personal level. And so it's not just another law. These are parts of the Bill of Rights, and we treasure them as much as you treasure the parts of the Bill of Rights that you feel are more important to your daily life. And so when we have this discussion, we have to have this discussion in an honest way, and by treating the Second Amendment as being less valid than other amendments, what ends up happening is the person you're communicating with just tunes you out, just looks at you as being someone that either doesn't understand the nature of the Constitution, or even worse, doesn't really respect us as gun owners and as patriotic Americans. So what I'm hoping with today's conversation is to get you thinking about the debate in a slightly different way. If you want to debate the merits of the Second Amendment, in terms of what type of collateral damage is acceptable, then I got you. You could come to me and say, you know what, Brian, I understand what you're saying. I love the First Amendment. You love the Second Amendment. And the First Amendment doesn't come without certain limitations. You can't incite violence through free speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Those are the types of speech that are in fact regulated. Great. And then you can come back at me and say, so what sorts of gun rights should have the same types of regulations and correspond to the types of societal compromises that we make with the First Amendment? Now we're talking on an equal footing. Now we're having an honest discussion. But when you come to me and you go, oh, that's Second Amendment, you and the NRA, whatever, that's when we tune you out and we're not able to listen to what you have to say. So that's my purpose with today's conversation, is to just have you think about the Second Amendment in a slightly different context. Now, some of you guys are just not going to agree with me. Some of you guys are going to think that the Second Amendment was a gigantic mistake, and that's fine, but recognize that it is still there. It's there, and it's part of the Bill of Rights, and it's not going anywhere unless Congress decides to get up and change it. So, so you have to really talk to us on that level and treat us like we are just as much lovers of civil liberties as you are. And I actually think that gun rights activists are civil libertarians, and I think that they are out there, and just the way the ACLU promotes expressions of the First Amendment, I think the NRA promotes expressions of the Second Amendment. And some of you guys are going to look at me like I'm crazy, but look, an amendment's an amendment. The Bill of Rights, you don't get to pick and choose which one's better than the other. And so if you're advocating for freedom that's enshrined in one of the Bill of Rights, I think you're a civil libertarian. And I don't think you get to just say, well, no, you're not really a civil libertarian. You know, those ACLU guys, those are real civil libertarians. I think that if you are advocating for a civil right, like the right to for an individual to protect themselves, I think you're every much a civil libertarian as any other. And so, yeah, that's my opinion, and you guys can have a different opinion. But what I'd like to do is hopefully massage the conversation over to a stage where at least we recognize that each of the Bill of Rights is a liberty in and of themselves, and you know what? They're going to have some negative consequences associated with them. And just because there are negative consequences associated with that liberty doesn't mean the liberty in and of itself is not valid. The same way we want to protect First Amendment rights, even though we know that people could get hurt over it, we need to protect Second Amendment rights, even though we know people can get hurt from it. The final point before I leave you here is I know that some people are going to say, well, it's not the same thing. You can't quantify the number of people that are hurt by First Amendment speech against the numbers of people that are hurt by Second Amendment rights. Well, you know, I'm with you to a point, to a degree. I think if you quantify it in numbers, I think you're right. If you quantify it in terms of injury, I'm not sure you're there. I, for years, drove past an intersection that had an abortion clinic on it, and there was an elderly woman there, and she held up a great big giant picture. I mean, the thing must have been 8 feet by 4 feet. I couldn't even believe she could hold it up, and it depicted what I imagined was a child that was mutilated, and it was an offensive picture to me. I didn't like looking at that on my morning commute. I found that to be a very offensive thing, but that's her First Amendment right. She was probably doing a pretty darn good job of inflicting quite a bit of psychological damage on women that were going to that clinic. Again, not really a great thing, but it was her First Amendment right, and whatever emotional scarring she gave over to those people, we as a society have determined that that was an acceptable compromise for her ability to protest. So, you know, I disagree. We've had a group that protests at the funerals for deceased members of our armed forces. I find their actions repugnant and offensive. Frankly, to take advantage of a family that's grieving for the loss of their young son or daughter in the service of our nation and keeping us free, to make some sort of an odd point about what you feel the failings of America are, I think is offensive to the highest degree. I think they've caused immense amount of psychological damage to those families, and unfortunately, it's still speech that has to be protected. And so, I don't think we can quantify it in terms of deaths. I agree with you on that. I think that if you're going to say one amendment versus another amendment, probably the Second Amendment, just by sheer numbers, there have been more people that have died from gun deaths each year than are going to die from criminals, getting out on exculpatory evidence, or criminals being released because they didn't have to incriminate themselves. But at the same time, when we're debating this, we need to debate again what the compromise leads to, the positive net benefits of personal protection. And so that's a debate I'm willing to have. I'm willing to talk about, look, this is what we have in terms of deaths related from violence and violence related to firearms, and this is what we have in terms of the numbers that we know people are able to protect themselves every year through having the availability of a firearm. And we can weigh those as a society. It's a better debate than saying my personal favorite part of the Bill of Rights is better than your favorite part of the Bill of Rights. That's not really a good debate, and that's part of where the disconnect happens. So that's what this conversation is about. Thanks for listening. Leave us some comments. Check us out on Facebook. Tell me I'm crazy. Tell me you like what I'm saying. Whatever it may be, it's totally fine. I don't know if I'm going to respond to all of them, but I'll definitely read all of them. And so thanks for listening, and we'll see you again.